The year is 1769, and you are born on a rocky island in the middle of the Mediterranean on the very day the Republic of Genoa officially hands Corsica over to France. You are christened Napoleon Bonaparte in the Cathedral of Ajaccio, and the priest who pours the water over your head has no idea that the child is anything other than the fourth son of a minor Corsican noble. Your father is Carlo Bonaparte, a minor Corsican noble who has spent his life switching sides in the island's endless factional fights, and who has lately made himself useful to the new French governor. You are the fourth of his children, the second son, and the household runs on credit, charm, and the iron discipline of your mother, who treats her children like a small regiment. From your earliest years, the contrast is plain. You speak Corsican at the table, Italian with your father, and only haltingly, badly, French, which is the language of the new rulers and the language of the schools you will soon be sent to. In 1779, when you are 9, your father pulls strings and gets you a place at a French religious school at Autun, on the mainland, and within a week you understand that you're not like the other boys. You cannot write French without spelling mistakes, your clothes are patched, and the other boys laugh at you behind your back, and sometimes when they think you are not listening, in front of your face. Within a year, your father is dead of stomach cancer at 39, and the family's fragile position in Corsican society collapses almost overnight. A royal scholarship saves you. You are sent to the military college at Brienne, in northern France, paid for by the king himself, and the cold is unlike anything you have ever known. You keep to yourself. You read Plutarch, you read Caesar, you read about ancient generals and ancient conquests, while the other boys play and gossip and pick fights. The other boys call you the little Corsican, and you learn to control your temper in public, but you never forget the insult, and you keep a list of every name in the back of your head. In the long winters, you walk the ramparts alone and watch the French live the life that you're not allowed to belong to, and you decide, very quietly, that you will belong to it anyway. In 1784, you are sent up to the École Militaire in Paris, the officer school for the sons of poor nobles, and Paris is bigger, louder, and about to explode. You finish the course in 1 year instead of 2, ranked 42nd out of 58. Not brilliant, but you're now a commissioned officer, age 17, with a small salary and a long way to go. You are posted to a gunnery regiment at Valence, and the pay is small, the uniform fits badly, and you live in cheap inns writing long, angry letters about Corsica, about France, and about yourself. In 1789, the Bastille falls, and the old world cracks open. And for a young officer with no money and no connections, the crack is also a door. You go back to Corsica, briefly, and you play the political game on the island. You side with the Jacobins, you publish a fiery little pamphlet, and you make a few enemies that you will keep for life. Then, in 1793, the revolution sends you to Toulon, where the royalists have handed the port over to the British fleet, and your first real chance arrives in the form of a problem nobody else can solve. You are 24, a captain of artillery, and you walk into a council of senior officers and tell them that they are wrong about how to take the hill that commands the harbor. You take the hill that night, in the rain, with a column of men and a few captured guns, and you turn the British position inside out in the morning. You are wounded in the thigh by a British bayonet at the moment of victory, and when Toulon falls, your name is suddenly the only name in the new army that matters. Within months, you are promoted to brigadier general, one of the youngest in the army, and Paris starts to talk about you in the same breath as the new regime's loudest men. Then comes 13 Vendémiaire, when royalist crowds march on the convention, and you meet them on the steps of a church with a handful of guns and a single, very cold order. You fire the grape shot into the street, the crowd breaks, and the Republic is saved in a single afternoon, which is also the moment the man who saved it becomes impossible to ignore. Around this time, you meet a widow 6 years older than you, named Josephine, and the new general of the Republic, who is bad at small talk and worse at love, falls hard. In March 1796, you are given command of the army of Italy, a half-starved, half-frozen rabble of 30,000 men on the edge of the Alps, and you are 26 years old. You stand in front of these men, who have not been paid in months, and who are eating the bark off the trees, and you promise them the riches of Italy. You cross the Alps in a few days, you outmarch the Austrian and Sardinian generals who expect you to take weeks, and you fall on the Piedmontese at the bottom of the slope before they have finished breakfast. Within a month you have broken the Piedmontese, taken their king hostage, fed your army on the spoils, and turned south into the heart of Italy. At Lodi, you watch your men charge across a bridge under Austrian guns, and the bridge becomes a kind of signature. The moment your soldiers see that you are willing to spend their lives and yours on the same gamble. At Arcola, 3 days of slog through swamp water and grape shot, you take the standard yourself and lead a charge across a bridge that everybody says is suicide, and by the end the Austrians are the ones retreating. At Rivoli, you break the last Austrian field army in Italy in a single January day, and you write to Paris that the war is over, which is not quite true, but it is the kind of lie that wins campaigns. In October 1797, by the Treaty of Campo Formio, you slice up the old Venetian Republic like a melon, and you walk out of Italy, the most famous general in Europe, at 28. You are full of yourself in a way that should be annoying, and the Directory in Paris, the 5 men who run the country, are both impressed and afraid of you. You propose a campaign to invade Egypt, half for the glory, half to keep yourself out of French politics, and the Directory, in a moment of collective foolishness, lets you go. In Egypt, you fight the Mamelukes under the pyramids, and your soldiers, who are half mad with heat and dysentery, when anyway, because the same trick works in the desert as in Italy, march fast, hit hard, and never let the enemy rest. Then, in August 1798, the British Admiral Nelson finds your fleet at anchor in Abu Qir Bay, and almost every ship you brought to Egypt goes to the bottom in a single night. You are stuck in Egypt, with an army that is shrinking by the week and no way home. And for the first time in your life, the game has stopped going your way. In the autumn of 1799, you slip out of Egypt, dodge the British fleet, and land in France with a small staff and an enormous plan. On 18 Brumaire, you walk into the council of 500 with a small group of soldiers. You break up the existing government, and by the end of the day, you're one of 3 consuls. And by the end of the year, you're the only one that matters. As first consul, you set out to do something no one in France has managed in a decade. You make the country actually work. You write the Civil Code, the famous Napoleonic Code, which sets French law in plain language for the first time, and which most of the world is still arguing about. You sign a concordat with Pope Pius VII, which pulls the Catholic Church back into the French state on your terms. And for a moment, half the world thinks you are a peacemaker. You rebuild the army, you rebuild the tax system, you build a national bank, you found the Legion of Honor, and you turn France from a broken republic into a country that runs on time. In 1802, you sign the Peace of Amiens with Britain. And for one brief strange year, there is no major war in Europe, which you used to tell the French that the revolution is over and that you are the one who ended it. Then, in May 1804, the Senate, on your own gentle suggestion, declares you Emperor of the French, and you accept with the kind of modest smile that fools no one. At the coronation, you take the crown out of the Pope's hands and place it on your own head, a single small gesture that tells every bishop and every monarch in Europe what the new order is going to look like. 3 years later, in 1807, you meet Tsar Alexander on a raft in the middle of the river Niemen at Tilsit, and between the two of you, you redraw the map of Europe. Then, in 1808, you invade Spain to put your brother Joseph on the throne, and almost immediately the campaign turns into the slow, ugly war that is the first real crack in your reign. The Spanish fight you with knives and ambushes and a refusal to lose politely. And your best marshals start writing home that this is a different kind of war from the clean victories in Italy. By 1811, your empire stretches from Lisbon to Moscow, but it is held together with bayonets, and the only way to keep the pieces from falling apart is to feed it another war. In June 1812, you cross the river Niemen into Russia at the head of the largest army Europe has ever seen. 600,000 men from 20 different nations. The Russians do something nobody else has done to you. They refuse to fight, and they keep retreating, burning their own crops as they go. You push deeper, expecting a Russian field army to finally stand and fight, and at Smolensk, in August, the Russians burn their own city to the ground rather than give it to you. At Borodino, in September, you finally get your pitched battle, and the bloodiest single day in the 19th century leaves both armies on their knees. You take Moscow in mid-September. You wait in the Kremlin for the Tsar to come begging, and for 5 strange weeks the only answer is the silence of an empty city. Then, in the 3rd week of September, somebody, you still do not know who, sets Moscow on fire, and the prize you crossed an empire to take burns to the ground in front of you. You wait in the ashes for another month. The Russian winter comes early, and in October you give the order to retreat, which is the first order you have given your life that you already know is a defeat. The retreat is the worst military disaster you have ever lived through. Cossacks on your flanks, the cold dropping below zero, your army shrinking by 10,000 men a day. At the Berezina in late November, the remnants of your army cross a river under Russian guns and lose another 30,000 men, and you barely make it across yourself. Of the 600,000 men who crossed into Russia in June, fewer than 100,000 stumble back across the Niemen in December. And you know, even before the last stragglers come in, that the empire is finished. You ride back to Paris ahead of your own army, slip into the Tuileries at night, and you start rebuilding a new force out of boys and recovering veterans, because stopping is not something you know how to do. In October 1813, at Leipzig, you fight the largest battle in European history, and you lose 300,000 men on the field, almost a third of them French, gone in a single day. You retreat across the Rhine in the rain with what is left of your army, and for the first time in your life, French soil is going to be the battlefield. In the spring of 1814, the Allies are at the gates of Paris. Your marshals are quietly telling you that the game is over, and the Senate is openly talking about restoring the Bourbons. In April 1814, at Fontainebleau, you sign the Act of Abdication. You try to poison yourself with the hidden packet you have been carrying for years, and when that fails, you accept the terms the Allies offer you. The Allies send you into exile on the island of Elba, in the Mediterranean with a small income and a small guard of soldiers, and you sail out of France in a British warship, watching the coast get smaller behind you. On Elba you potter about, you build roads, you walk the hills, you write a few bitter little memos about the new Bourbon king, and you watch the news from France trickle in like a slow fever. The Bourbons, restored to the throne, are clumsy and unpopular. And by the end of the winter, the old officers in France are quietly asking each other whether it might be time to bring you back. On February 26th, 1815, you quietly sail out of Elba with a few hundred men, a single small ship, and a small flag with the bees of the old empire embroidered on it. You land in southern France, you walk straight past the soldiers sent to stop you, and as you march north, regiment after regiment sent to intercept you simply steps aside and joins you instead. You walk back into the Tuileries in triumph. The king flees the country without firing a shot, and the wildest gamble of your life pays off in 20 days flat. You give this brief second reign a name yourself. Les 100 jours, the 100 days, and you know from the day you land that the clock is now running in the wrong direction. You have, in theory, an empire again, and a marshal or two who still believe in you. But you also have a country that is exhausted, an army that is half raw recruits, and 7 crowned heads who are all marching their armies back toward you. In June 1815, you march north into Belgium with the army, hoping to knock the British and the Prussians apart before they can join up. At Quatre Bras on June 16th, you push the British back, but you fail to stop their Prussian allies from slipping away to the east, and that single mistake is going to cost you everything. On June 18th, 1815, on a muddy ridge south of Brussels called Waterloo, you watch your infantry throw themselves at the British line again and again, and the British line, for once, does not break. Then, in the late afternoon, the dust cloud on the eastern horizon turns out to be the Prussians, arriving exactly on the field the British needed them, and your army is now being squeezed between 2 enemies at once. By the time the sun goes down, the army you have rebuilt in 100 days is broken into little fleeing groups in the dark, and you ride away from the field, very quiet, with a small escort of loyal officers. You ride back to Paris, you abdicate for the second time in 12 months, and you ask the British for asylum, which is the worst kind of gamble, because you know what the British are like when they have finally won. The British government, in a rare moment of smallness, decides that Elba is too close, and they pick a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic called Saint Helena, and they put you on a ship. You land on Saint Helena in October 1815. You take a small house called Longwood on a bare windswept plateau, and you understand for the first time in your life that you are not going to leave. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, watches you the way a prison warden watches a dangerous animal. He is petty, suspicious, and he reads every letter you write. You dictate your memoirs to a small group of loyal officers. You dictate letters to whoever will publish them in Europe, and you try to shape the story of your own life before somebody else shapes it for you. You tell anyone who will listen, in the famous phrase, that you are the revolution, and you mean it, and it is also the loneliest sentence you have ever said out loud. By 1820, your stomach is failing. The doctors and attendants argue in French about whether it is cancer or hepatitis, and the wind off the South Atlantic never stops blowing through the cracks in the walls. In the spring of 1821, you slip in and out of consciousness for days, and the loyal men around you take turns reading aloud from the old books of campaigns you used to love. On the 5th of May, 1821, at Longwood House on the island of Saint Helena, at the age of 51, you die. The men around you, who knew you, write down that your last words, in the small hours of the morning, were about the head of the army, and about France. The British bury you on the island, under a plain slab without your name on it, a quiet little spite, 20 years after Waterloo, that even the most polite historians still bring up. 20 years later, in 1840, the new French king lets your old guard bring your bones back to Paris, and you are buried under the golden dome of Les Invalides, with a great bronze statue of you on top. And here is the strange thing, the last strange thing, the empire itself died on Saint Helena, but the code of law you wrote is still the spine of civilian justice in something like 100 countries around the world. You are the outsider from Corsica who spoke French with an accent, who was mocked by French nobles, who crowned himself emperor, who reformed every institution France had, who lost everything in Russia, and who came back and lost everything again at Waterloo. And you, the little Corsican with the patched coat and the bad French, are still, 250 years later, the single most studied military mind in the history of the world. What nobody tells you, when you're 9 years old and the French boys are laughing at your accent, is that the man they're laughing at is the same man who, 20 years later, will redraw the map of Europe in his own handwriting. You learn, in Italy, that you can outthink older men, outmarch them, and outfight them, and that the only real ceiling on your life is the ceiling you put there yourself. You also learn, much later, in the snow on the road back from Moscow, that the same speed, the same willingness to gamble, can run a great army straight off a cliff. You take the crown from the Pope's hands, and the gesture is read 2 ways at once. A public humiliation of the church, and a private statement that, in a new France, no authority, stands above you. At Tilsit, you and Tsar Alexander split the world between you on a painted raft. And for one strange summer, it looks like the whole continent is going to be run by two young emperors in matching uniforms. In Spain, you discover the thing nobody in your old wars had warned you about, that an entire people fighting a slow guerrilla war from 1,000 little villages can bleed an empire dry one village at a time. On Saint Helena, the great conqueror sits in a small bare room, dictates his campaigns to a young officer, and slowly realizes that the only empire he has left is the one in his own head. What you actually changed in those quiet years as consul was not France. It was the idea of what a modern state is supposed to look like, and that change did not need a single battlefield. At Waterloo, the British line holds, the Prussians arrive, and the Second Empire of France is finished in a single afternoon, which is the kind of speed that used to belong only to your own victories. The shape of your life, looking back, is a kind of zigzag that nobody in your century had ever lived and nobody since has been able to repeat. Outsider, general, consul, emperor, exile, legend. You are the only ruler in modern European history to take the crown from the Pope's hands and put on his own head with his own two hands, and you are also the only one to do it twice. You spend 10 quiet months on Elba, walking the same hills, eating the same local food, watching the same little waves, and by the end of it the quiet is driving you mad. When you come back alone with about 700 men, and the trick is so theatrical, so perfectly you, that a continent that has spent a year trying to forget you remembers you in 3 weeks. Saint Helena is, in the end, the longest of your wars. 6 slow years, no battles, no marshals, no Paris, and the only enemy is the wind in your own stomach. Your marshals are an extraordinary kind of family. 12 of them, mostly the sons of innkeepers and peasants, who together with you turned a small revolutionary army into the most efficient killing machine the world had ever seen. You do not love Spain, and Spain does not love you. And the war you start there in 1808 turns out to be the first war of your life that you cannot win on speed alone. You come back from Russia with about 100,000 men, and you have the cold nerve to start a new war the next spring, and the spring after that, because you are still you, and stopping is the one thing you do not know how to do. In 1813, at Leipzig, you lose the biggest battle in history, and for the first time in your life, the marshals who are supposed to be loyal start quitting on the field mid-fight. In April 1814, your marshals tell you, in your own palace, that the game is over. And the hardest thing you do all year is not losing the war. It is sitting still and signing the paper that ends it. You try one last time to slip out the back door of life with a hidden packet of poison. And when the poison fails, you sit very still, very small, in a small gilded room in Fontainebleau. And you accept what is coming. On Elba, you spend your days building little roads, planting little crops, and pretending to the few loyal men around you that this is retirement, which it is, until it isn't. When you come back as a joke, a defeated exile, with a single small ship sailing toward the country that has just signed your death warrant. And the joke, somehow, becomes the most dangerous thing that has happened in Europe in a decade. You walk back into the Tuileries alone, in a plain dark coat, with the same calm, slightly amused look you have had since you were 20, and the Bourbon King is already in a carriage on the road to Belgium. In Belgium, in June 1815, you gamble everything on a single day, and for the first time in your life the dice land on a number you did not know was in a box. The British, in a rare moment of smallness, send you to a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic because they are scared that if they let you live in Europe, even quietly, you will find a way back in again. You do not find a way back, and that is the only battle you ever truly lose. The slow, 6-year-long battle against a small, windswept rock and a thin British officer named Hudson Lowe. Your stomach gives out in the spring of 1821, and the last of the long wars you have been fighting with your own body ends in a small, dim, drawn curtain room in the middle of the South Atlantic. 20 years after Waterloo, the new French king, in a clever piece of politics, lets your old guard bring your bones back to Paris through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of silent Frenchmen. The empire itself died on Saint Helena, but the code of law you wrote is still the spine of civilian justice in something like 100 countries around the world, from Belgium to Louisiana, from Italy to Japan. The final strange thing, is that the small boy with the patched coat and the bad French is still, 250 years later, the single most studied military mind in the history of the world. What nobody tells you, when you're 9 years old and the French boys are laughing at your accent, is that the man they're laughing at is the same man who, 20 years later, will redraw the map of Europe in his own handwriting. On Saint Helena, the great conqueror sits in a small bare room, dictates his campaigns to a young officer, and slowly realizes that the only empire he has left is the one in his own head. And in the end, what you leave behind is not the empire, and not the throne, and not the great battles, but a way of thinking about how a country, any country, is supposed to be run. That is your life as Napoleon Bonaparte. Outsider, general, consul, emperor, exile, legend, and a small boy with a patch coat who somehow talked a continent into doing what he wanted for a quarter of a century.